Thank you for being here, and welcome to the second day of the Mroz Global Leadership Inaugural Convening. My name is Mroz Kovalev. I'm the Bennett Director of the Mroz Institute, and it is my pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Damon Wilson. Damon Wilson is President and CEO of the National Endowment for Democracy. This is an independent, non-profit, grant-making foundation supporting freedom around the world. Prior to joining NED, National Endowment for Democracy, he helped transform the Atlantic Council, another major think tank, into a global think tank as its executive vice president. Previously, Damon served as special assistant to President George W. Bush. He served as a senior director for European affairs at the National Security Council. He served at the U.S. embassies in Baghdad and Beijing. He served as deputy director to NATO Secretary General. He also worked at the Department of State Office for European Security and Policy Affairs. Damon completed his master's degree at the Princeton School of Law of Public and International Affairs. And Damon is a local Charlestonian, so he's coming back home, and it's good to have him here. He became a good friend of the Mroz Institute and the School of Languages, Cultures, and World Affairs over the last year. When I took my cohort of global ambassadors to Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, Damon arranged a visit to the National Endowment for Democracy for us, and he brought his colleagues for an engaging discussion. On a personal note, many of you were asking about my family, from my hometown in Vinnytsia. Damon apparently has been to Vinnytsia with his father, who also has a Charleston connection. He was a classics professor at the Department of Classics here at the College of Charleston. With no further ado, thank you for joining us, Damon.
Thank you, Max. Thank you so much, Max. It just underscores how much people matter that Mroz Kovalev happens to be hosting us now in the midst of this crisis, coming from a town, Vinnytsia, where my father lived when he joined the Peace Corps after teaching here at the College of Charleston as a classics professor in the department that Tim Johnson runs. It's really beautiful. Max, thank you for having us here. I'm going to talk a little bit about democracy as strategy in an age of authoritarianism. But I want to ground it a little bit in people and experiences with a view towards the students who are here to think about how things develop. But first, I do want to thank Professor Kovalev, Dean Tim Johnson, and President Zhu, who's here as well. Thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for making this a reality in partnership with the extraordinary leadership of the East-West Institute. It is really heartwarming to see the marriage coming here. I didn't have the chance to work with John Mroz, but as Stephen Hines and others have talked to me about him, he really inspired a model that we adopted at my former organization, the Atlantic Council with Fred Kemp, of intellectual entrepreneurism based in ideas, creativity of ideas, and people. And I think we all know and recognize that his leadership, his ideas are needed in times of crisis like we're experiencing right now. It's also a real pleasure because we have some friends who've traveled from far to be here to see this amazing city. And it's really, for me, as a kid who grew up in Charleston, to know that there's now a Mroz Global Leadership Institute here. It's inspiring. I grew up here. I spend as much time as I can here, just a few blocks away. And I'm really proud to know and be somewhat part of this vibrant community that you are helping to build here, an ecosystem that is so vital. And I've been a champion ambassador for Charleston as a global city, its port, the manufacturing hub, a global tourist destination, the investments that this college has made in language study abroad, the international studies program, I think graduating more in the top 35 of all universities in the United States. And now at the Mroz Institute, the global ambassadors who I've been able to meet, just really proud and to be part of this ecosystem. But we have to use it for something. We have to use it for a purpose. So I want to discuss democracy as strategy against the backdrop of authoritarian resurgence. And it's based on what you've heard from President Biden talking about how this is an inflection point between democracy and autocracy, I think accurately defining this moment historically. But man, if you didn't get that going into a summit for democracy in December, it's driven home by the reality of Putin's extraordinary, unabashed attacks, unprovoked attack on Ukraine now. And so my view, my belief that support for democracy and the simple democratic aspirations of individuals is the most effective and frankly most cost-effective national security strategy is born out of my experience transitioning from humanitarian to national security to democracy support communities. And I want to anchor my views in people, not in grand strategy. I love grand strategy. I come from the think tank world, National Security Council. But like John Mroz, I understand that it's connecting with people, learning from people, and is where we actually get things done and we learn. And so I like to keep that mind, the individuals that we're thinking about around the world, front and center in my work. So as you're developing your own careers, don't get lost in the history and the geopolitics. You need to know them. You need to study that. But keep focused on the people and the relationships that are going to be the bridge through your own experiences. It's animated my career in a way that I don't think of my career as a career. I think of it as a vocation. And the people that I get to work with and spend time with, it's truly soul nourishing. It's not a job. And I think that's what you're embarking on in your own studies here. So I grew up here in Charleston, but I spent a few years in rural North Carolina when my father was teaching at a small university in Bowie's Creek, North Carolina. And a young man in third grade, my best friend, was the son of a dissident professor who had fled from Nicolae Ceausescu's Romania. And this was a particularly brutish dictator of Romania. And it helped me as a kid not truly understand what tyranny meant intellectually, but it certainly helped me understand what tyranny meant to a third grader, to a family, and what it meant to the dignity of an individual family that we were able to welcome in a small rural community of North Carolina. And it sort of stuck with me a little bit, the privilege I had to be born an American, and the opportunity to work with and support those who wanted just a shot at determining their own future like we have. So this animated my studies. I went off to Duke University, and I spent my first year at Duke overseas, my first summer there, in Estonia. I went to live in the Baltic nation of Estonia. One of the global ambassadors, I don't know if she's here, spent time in Estonia recently on an internship. So I went there for my first year in college for a summer during its first year of independence, or rather re-independence. So right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, before it even had its first elections. And I watched the abstractions of freedom and free markets be put into practice by leaders who were frankly not much older than many of you, certainly are younger than me today. And I found so much inspiration in watching them reestablish their nation, which had been extinguished 50 years before, but they were taking inspiration from us. And it was powerful. I remember my last night in Tallinn, I had a young man who was one of my hosts, and I took him out to dinner just to offer my gratitude. And after we finished the meal, he told me that that was the first time in his life that he had ever eaten in a restaurant. And just as a kid, to kind of understand the deprivations of communism and what that meant, he had never eaten in a restaurant. I didn't even understand that. So the next year I traveled around Central Europe watching democracies being reestablished when people like Stephen Hines were in the thick of it helping that happen. And I was at school at a time of incredible opportunity, follow the Berlin Wall and the opportunity that came from it. But I saw the dark side emerge. Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait. Nationalist leaders led their countries into war, nations into war in the Balkans, slaughtering 100,000 in Bosnia, threatening genocide in Kosovo. Politicians that orchestrated a genocide in Rwanda, killing as many as 900,000 people in 3 months. And so watching that at a time when America was ascendant, but the world was messy, I wanted to understand the dark side because I wanted to figure out how we could do something to stop it. A little bit naively, but as an American in the 1990s, I could think that way. The United States, after all, was the only superpower and essentially emerged as a sort of a guarantor of global order and inspiration at the time. So when I was studying abroad in France and in college, I decided to head to the Balkans on my spring break. And I stayed at a cheap hostel with peacekeeping troops that were there in Croatia. And I talked to students in cafes. I talked to people to understand how people live through war and what it means. And this sort of drove me to go back and find at Duke a professor teaching refugee courses and to work with him to go back and work in the Balkans with something called the Unaccompanied Children in Exile Project, where we helped children who were separated from their parents during the war be reunited, to locate them if they were still surviving or relatives. And as I went into my senior year, the wars in the Balkans were eclipsed by this atrocious genocide, the horror of genocide in Rwanda. And so, without much planning, after graduating, I went to Rwanda to work for Save the Children the first year after a genocide. The only time I directly defied my mother, who is a proud Charlestonian. And in Rwanda, I worked with local communities, and we helped them care for children who lost their parents, either because they were murdered victims or because they were imprisoned perpetrators. We worked in the prisons where those who had been accused of genocide, often the women brought their children, and helped set up preschools to get them out of the atrocious conditions there. But my real takeaway there was one of frustration. I was in the humanitarian field, and yet I saw how the Interahamwe, the rebels who had inflicted so much damage, were using refugee camps in the eastern Congo as a political base to continue the warfare. And in the humanitarian world, you're neutral. You support everybody. It's beautiful. But there were a lot of bad leaders, evil people doing bad things. This is the story that I learned from the Balkans. I learned from Rwanda. It's not ethnic hatreds. We all have divisions and cleavages in our society. To translate them into this war and this murder, you would see, it takes people like Vladimir Putin. It takes evil leaders to manipulate these cleavages and populations to turn those latent divisions into something that can be really awful. And that drove me to think, as much as I respected the humanitarian field, I wanted to do something about that. And so it led me to think about going into national security, but anchored by the idea of supporting the agency of people to determine their own futures. Something so free, something so simple about individual freedom could unlock something so important in national security. And so in government, I really grappled with this. I went to work at the National Security Council, and I worked there 3 times over a couple of different administrations. And I worked, at one point I was working on Belarus. I was involved in helping to pass work on the Belarus Democracy Act, where we lined up resources behind Belarusian Democrats. I started to bring in dissidents. I hosted Irina Krasoskayeva and the Wives of the Disappeared. Lukashenko, before the Lukashenko you know today, when he came to power, he disappeared some inconvenient journalists in his country. And I brought their spouses in to meet with the president. And it was just so compelling to me to see the power of what this meant for individuals and the power of the United States giving them protection and exposure by spotlighting them. But I remember sitting in these highly classified reviews of what we're doing on our intelligence, investments in the intelligence community. I'm not talking specifics, I can talk about it generally. And everything we were looking at putting money into, it was all about the negative stuff that comes from autocratic states, shipments of arms, potential weapons of mass destruction development. And it just sort of struck me, all the things that we cared about and were concerned about and were spending tons of money against really begin to dissipate when you see civil society gain a voice, independent freedom flourish, and a society be able to evolve and be a more open democratic society. Autocrats that brutalize their own people will be a threat to other free people. But I saw this inversion in the national security system where civil society, democracy, it's all the fluffy, soft stuff. We actually don't think about the resource allocation. We're putting billions all into the hard stuff, into the more difficult things. And it led me to think about how the support for democracy is our most cost-effective national security strategy. And at the time, I felt a little bit out of place. I felt like the national security folks thought I was a little in the wrong place. But for me, it seemed directly connected. I saw this in the Orange Revolution. I handled Ukraine at the White House. The Orange Revolution, in which Ukrainians turned out to overturn a stolen, which we were pretty confident was a stolen presidential election. And yet, they forced a new election, brought President Yushchenko to power, and I watched as we did everything to try to do what we could to support a democratic opening in Ukraine. And yet, over time, we saw the Ukrainian leadership negotiate a gas deal with intermediaries based in Switzerland, which had really no purpose except to provide for a network for corruption and taking money off the top. opening up a channel for Moscow and the Russians to completely manipulate Ukraine. I saw the president's kids using a fleet of 12 cars from the government, one driving a Bentley around town, and at the NSC thinking we're doing everything to support this country. And it made me see corruption as a national security issue. Again, something that did not resonate at that time. People didn't think the idea of corruption was a direct threat to national security, and a way I saw it unfolding in front of us. And so this is essentially kind of what led me to go from a humanitarian field to a national security field to democracy support, where I am at the National Endowment for Democracy, where it's about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Look at Ukraine today. Russian troops are stopped because ordinary people, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of ordinary Ukrainians are doing extraordinary things. And so the endowment, the National Endowment for Democracy, I see as America's foundation for freedom and democracy. And it's extraordinary, growing out of the tradition on the left and the labor movement to support solidarity in Poland, Lech Walesa, Jimmy Carter's push for emphasis on human rights, joined by a push from the right and President Reagan, an anti-communist push, coming together in Congress, leading to President Reagan to announce the idea of setting up an independent foundation that could support Democrats, the idea of American civil society supporting civil society around the world, to create the endowment, where we have joined Democrats, Republicans, business, and labor, all who disagree, all who fight domestically, come together to say, when we engage in the world, we engage in a way that rises above that to support the voice of others. And today, the endowment, we have a $300 million appropriation from Congress. We're working on 124 countries, 2,000 partners around the world. It's a unique institution because it's publicly funded, but privately run. We're independent so that we're not subject to the whims of any administration or any policy, to be persistent and consistent in the values of supporting grassroots civil society, media, democratic institutions. And we're demand-driven, the exact opposite of the stereotype that you hear, democracy at the end of a gun. That's not the way we think about it. Americans showing up to tell you how to run your democracy, no thank you. We're here to say, what do you need? How can we help? It's about listening to others and being supportive. Being a venture capital for democracy, taking prudent risks where government agencies probably couldn't. Being present in really tough cases, being flexible and quick. In Ukraine, we've been able to move like that as we watch other government agencies stumble through procurements and regulations and bureaucracies. None of that for us. We've been able to, on the eve of this war, all of our grantees essentially make them cash liquid so that they could go into a war confident that we were going to make them comfortable financially, to be able to pay people. And the day that Kherson was occupied in the south, our grantee called and he said, I want you to tell me my bank just called and said all the money's here. The next day, he organized a civilian organization, thousands of Ukrainians in front of Russians with guns just waving Ukrainian flags. You've seen the images on TV. It's really beautiful. So we are at an inflection point right now, sharpened by what Vladimir's Putin, of democracy versus autocracy. And it wasn't obvious. The number of democracies has exploded from 29 when I was born, 29 democracies when I was born, to 77 when I went to college. And when I was in college, it was for the first time in history that democracies represented a majority in the world. We felt that this was momentum. It was the ongoing push of a third democratic wave. But in 2006, we didn't know it at the time, we could sort of feel it piecemeal, but a democratic recession began. One that continues today. 16 years of erosion in global levels of political rights and civil liberties. Over the past decade, 1 in 6 democracies have failed. Democratic erosion in democracies combined with an authoritarian resurgence, and what we see, sharp power, not soft power, the sharp power, particularly of Moscow, Beijing, not just being used to repress those at home, but being used as the tools and tactics to export to others abroad. It's metastasized. And so the challenges that we face today are actually quite different than the challenges that the endowment was expected to address when it was founded, or even over 15 years ago. So I call them with our team the defining challenges to democracy for us to figure out how we raise our game. And it begins with democratic erosion and political polarization that undermine democratic institutions and cultures, and we're all free peoples are subject to that. We see that. But it's also about sharper authoritarian repression at home that closes off civic space and has created major numbers of democratic diasporas, diaspora groups from Burma to Russia that are coming out in huge numbers. It's authoritarian influence that's being exported globally, namely through China and Russia and their projection of influence, their distortion of international organizations and norms. It's the use of a digital disinformation challenge that's become a feature of the global landscape. We see it every day. We almost see through it right now as you watch the Russian propaganda play out. But the real audiences that's going for are in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and India, where they're not as attuned to what they're seeing. Modern kleptocracy, whose corrosive effects are woven into societies everywhere, using the access of financial security and rule of law in the West to launder corrupt money made in other societies, and to mix this in a way that turbocharges the challenges we see. And you overlay that to emerging technologies, which can be a force for good, incredibly so, but we've seen the autocrats use these with digital authoritarianism, surveillance enabled by artificial intelligence that gives the reach of the state really scary potential. So in response, part of what I've been talking about is how to think of democracy not just as a value or principles or ideas that we care about, not as a rhetoric and not just as a summit, but really to transition to think of democracy as strategy. When I worked in government, you'd often have the regional folks, the national security folks working on tough issues, and then you'd have the democracy people over here. And you'd see these things happen in a way that in the bureaucratic politics of the US government really devalued some of that. But what I'm trying to argue is how do we actually deliver on what President Biden's begun to articulate by putting democracy at the center of policymaking, not just for the ideals of it, but for our hard-nosed interests that the advance of democracy is the most cost-effective means to ensure national security. And by capturing the idea, democracy as strategy, so that means putting democratic unity as policy. When another small democracy is being attacked, like the Chinese did with Lithuania when they welcomed the Taiwanese, when Taiwan itself is, that we respond and rally immediately to help support democracies under duress, as we saw Australia dealing on. Oftentimes these democracies are figuring out on their own. Democracy as strategy would mean we are prepared to back them up as soon as there is a challenge. That we stand in solidarity on the front lines of those in the fight. Even before this war, Taiwan and Ukraine were front and civil for me, but also civil society around the world. That we develop a sense of a right to assist, that civil societies around the world have a right to assist other civil societies in their cause of advancing their own voices. It also means having democracy as a prism through which we develop our strategies. And I've been involved in a lot of strategy-making processes where you build in the other countries as to consult them or get buy-in as an afterthought, usually at the end of the process. Democracy as strategy would mean how are we developing our strategies with democratic allies so that we're building a common approach to China, a common approach to the future of AI, a common approach to terrorism, with democratic allies at the table so that we're bought in and coming to this issue in a way that brings 80% of the global GDP to a challenge, not just as an afterthought. And that increasingly we see that the alignment of values and interests doesn't always work, but we're most effective when we align the values and interests, and I argue most sustainable with the American people. So it means being intentional about free societies, about a free world, intentional about a global coalition for democracy. There's almost a campaign mentality. It's a core of it we see playing out right now in a transatlantic relationship, yes. NATO allies at the spine, with our Asian allies really very much there. But increasingly an inclusive global South that is democratic and wants a say in this as being baked into a way of thinking about this approach. We haven't seen that unified response around the world in reaction to Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. It's the kind of approach we need to invest in and develop as an intentional strategy with other democracies. But the challenge right now is pretty immediate. It's stark because of what we're seeing. And I think many of you know history shows that a tyrant's appetite for conquest is never satisfied, and that we've got to figure out how we protect freedom today. So to apply these principles in our response today, first I come back to people. It's their mobilization, Ukrainians first and foremost, that will be among the most effective means to complicate the Kremlin's aggression. We need to keep them and support for them front and center in any long-term strategy. Helping them understand that we support them, providing that support, understanding ordinary people doing extraordinary things is powerful. It's their determination and ingenuity, along with a long track record of support that made civil society one of the incredible success stories in Ukraine, despite its uneven political leadership, or despite the challenges of corruption. An activated population, an activated civil society, a decentralized system there is now guaranteeing potentially Ukraine's sovereignty in a way that centralized approach had not transformed Ukraine fast enough. So we embrace the fact that they have a say in determining their future. Second, given Putin's track record, deterrence today requires more than even some of the strong responses we're seeing. We communicated in advance what would happen, and yet it did not deter Vladimir Putin from his aggression. I'm interested in hearing Mroz Global tonight to talk about this because this is a challenging area for policy. But it pushes me to think that we need more creative thinking and policies about disrupting Vladimir Putin's Russia, increasing the cost of his actions across the board, rather than waiting for escalation. If you do this, we will do that. If you do this, we will do that. It hasn't worked, it hasn't deterred. Is there an approach to a disruption that could be more effective? But I think the most important part of this comes back to people and the message of our commitment to stand by the Russian people. That has to remain front and center. It's going to be too easy to vilify Russia. Coverage boils down to Russia versus Ukraine, Russia versus the US. We need to understand this is Putin's Russia that he has created and avoid vilifying its people in this cause. And outreach to the Russian people is key to lay the groundwork for a future, a more constructive relationship, ultimately with a post-Putin Russia that does respect the rule of law. And keeping that in mind, because the people paying the biggest price right now are among the people paying the biggest price, I will not say that over Ukrainians, are the Russians themselves who spent the past year in a crackdown to help prepare for what we're seeing right now. But we also need to understand we don't need a spirit of defeatism. China on the march, Russia using its weapons. Leading democracies can leverage collective capabilities to influence and defend against autocratic challengers. So yes, there's a global power shift. It's not like it was in 1990 when I was coming out of college. But the leading democracies in North America, Europe, the Asia Pacific, they still make up 3/4 of global domestic product. The United States and its closest allies commit 6 times more the resources to defense expenditure than Russia and China combined. Democracies provide 80% of the development aid worldwide, the humanitarian support worldwide. And in global opinion polls, the 20 highest scoring in terms of soft power, they're all democracies. Individuals, mothers and fathers, understand what it means for their children to have individual dignity, to have that type of freedom. So these assets provide us with enormous sources of leverage. And if over time we're able to be more effective at including other democracies around the world, their influence within the international system can be even more pronounced. So it does require recognizing that a rising China gathering in strength and a declining Russia aggressively seeking to roll back post-Cold War gains, they do pose a threat to the United States and our democratic allies. They're trying to make the world safe for autocracy by defanging international norms, international organizations. And yet if we handle this crisis right, it's possible that you could see divisions begin to be disrupted among some of the populist autocrats and others. February 24th has really driven this home because 2 factors made the Russian invasion something that could be a watershed moment. The stark moral clarity in Ukraine's cause and the existential security threat presented by a newly aggressive Russia, particularly to Europe. It's made things that seemed impossible now possible because of political will and the shift of public opinion. And there have been very few challenges or conflicts that we have seen in our lifetime of such consequence that have been so black and white to help underscore what I think is going to be required is more of a generational movement, a generational commitment to defend democracy and to confront autocracy. And it requires a bit of a paradigm shift to mount a generational struggle to see this not as Ukraine's fight alone, not as Taiwan's fight alone, but ours. And that our own freedoms cannot be taken for granted, or those of our allies. And so this requires understanding the stakes of what's playing out right now, figuring out how we muster the resolve so that we understand that some sacrifice may need to be needed on our part, and that we still recognize that American action and leadership is so fundamental to catalyzing the kind of response that's required. This kind of work is not my career, it's my vocation, it's a calling. And right now, it means that we've got to do everything we can to help Ukraine strengthen a free Ukrainian state, help Ukraine win. The most significant solidarity package that we will have seen since the Marshall Plan, a modern-day equivalent to a Berlin airlift to support its people, and a recognition that civil resistance of society actors is so key to this outcome. To think about a paradigm shift about Russia, outreach to its people, thinking about how to bolster deterrence with policies of disruption around the world, focusing on bolstering our NATO alliance as the president heads off to Europe to do so, understanding that means more permanent presence in the East, but essentially thinking through a conundrum, which is a gray zone between Russia and Europe, a gray zone which has been, for Vladimir Putin, a zone of temptation. And so, how do we actually stay focused on those that are worried about the impact for their freedoms, a Belarus that's lost its sovereignty, a Moldova, Armenia, Georgia that are in Putin's shadow? There are opportunities that we need to be thinking about as well. I've talked to one of our colleagues, Maya's here, from the Western Balkans, at a time of ambivalence in the Balkans for their reforms, with ambivalence in Brussels about their future in Europe. We should be using a time like this with clarity to consolidate the Western Balkans, advance a Europe whole and free, ensure that there is not an opportunity for mischief-making, as Russia will veto a UN Security Council resolution on Bosnia this fall to provoke a crisis there, as Russia will partition Ukraine and offer Transcarpathia to Hungary or Bessarabia to Romania to try to split the allies. So part of this includes redoubling support for Democrats around the world, coming together in a sense of a coalition of how we turn the tide. I had the great privilege to be able to work with many Russians who have tried to lay out a different future for their country. I had the privilege to work with Boris Nemtsov, who was assassinated for his beliefs of a different Russia. But he was assassinated at a time when he and his team were doing a major study on Putin's war in Ukraine. Not today's, the earlier one. And his team, after his assassination, his team doubled down on a commitment to release this report. And so when I was at the Atlantic Council, we were also doing a version called Hiding in Plain Sight, documenting Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine through the voices, the social media footprint, the voices of the Russian soldiers themselves. And so we joined together to release these two reports, to release a campaign on Putin at war. And before I came here, just this last week, I had lunch with his deputy, Vladimir Kara-Murza, one of the activists, Russian politician, who has also been poisoned and hospitalized because of his political activity, survived. And we were talking about this episode that Boris Nemtsov, understanding that the Russia he believed in wanted to be friends with its neighbors in a new configuration of respect, and could see that the Russian ability to be close to their neighbors could be a source of power for Russia and influence in a positive way. And Vladimir Kara-Murza was leaving this lunch with me to fly back to Moscow. And I said, "What are you doing? I mean, we see what's happening. We see what's happening. Everybody's coming out." And he said, "Look, it is such a selfish act for me to go home. I have to have a clean conscience. Because Vladimir Putin is trying to say this is my Russia doing it. And it's not. I need to be there to say this is not what the Russian people, this is not all of us. And so going home is a selfish act." And so I just want to conclude with that, because it's clear to me that the Russian people don't have a future with Vladimir Putin there. It is their struggle. But how, as we support the Ukrainians, as we support Democrats around the world, as we redefine the way we think about democracy as not something nice on the side, but democracy is central to our strategy to support the aspirations of others, not to tell them what to do. Democracy is the opportunity to screw up on your own and have a system where you can fix yourself. We do it all the time in the United States. And so I conclude just with a thought, we've got to get big strategy right. We've got to think about national security. But ultimately, it's simplicity of what individual people are able to do, how they relate to each other, how they can pursue careers, their lives. The simplicity of freedom for the individuals is such a beautiful, elegant way to think about a national security strategy that embraces democracy, connecting what we do in Washington with the lives of people around the world. So I'm going to stop with that. Love to open it up for comments, questions, a conversation, and hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon. We have two microphones here on both sides, and I would like to give an opportunity to some of our students to ask a question or two, and then before opening it to the general audience. Are there any questions? Let's go to the general audience then, to our guests.
I know your students are not shy. I've heard from half of them in other settings, so I want to hear from you.
So thank you for your comments. My name's Vera Trojan, and I would be interested in hearing you pursue how this unfolds both within Russia domestically. You hinted this is clearly not a war that most of the Russian people support. So is there hope that there is enough of a democratic movement there that could overthrow Putin? You know, how do you see his demise come to pass? So that would be optimistic. And then in the meantime, what more can the democratic world be doing to support Ukraine?
Thanks. Good questions and tough questions. First of all, I think the reality is quite a few Russian people don't understand what's happening and therefore do support the special military operation. If you talk to the same Russian family, in fact, I've talked to a few families that are split with family in Ukraine, family in Russia, or you talk to a 24-year-old woman and her 86-year-old grandmother, there's a different world, different environment. Where do you get your information? And so, in some respects, many of the Russians that we're talking to feel that the past year was one of the worst, has been the worst year in closing civic space, closing off independent media. We had more Russians who work in this area flee last year than we've had in in previous years combined. We thought it was bad until the war started, and it's gotten even worse. But what it's done is consolidated an information environment in which if you get your news from TV, from newspapers, that you are in an echo chamber. You're in a Kafkaesque environment. Understanding that there was threats to Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk, that there are Nazis in Ukraine despite having a Jewish president, that this information environment has created that. You see Russians that are savvy, have technological access to information, those that were on Instagram and Facebook and others, but those have been shut down. YouTube was up, and now there's pressure to stop YouTube. So VPNs, these networks that you can access, are still available. And so you see a real disconnect between people depending on how they consume information. You also do see protests. Russian Democrats have told me they've tracked about 15,000 arrests against people who have been in anti-war protests since this has begun. Yabloko, which is one of the few remaining opposition parties, just published pins that are about no war, calling for peace. And now you get a 30-day prison sentence if you just showed up wearing a little pin, a little badge. This is Stalinist style repression beginning. If you watch Putin's most recent speeches, they use the language that is dehumanizes individuals. We've seen that in Rwanda, we've seen that in the Balkans. If you dehumanize someone, it becomes easy to kill them, to exterminate them. So I'm actually quite worried about what's going to happen in Russia as an opening of a Stalinistic type chapter. Stalin, of course, was the Soviet leader who oversaw the Great Famine, a man-induced famine in Ukraine that killed millions of Ukrainians in the early 1930s. It's called the Holodomor. Anne Applebaum's written an incredible book about it. And we see a new version of this coming from Putin, both in the distrust of the identity of Ukrainians, an obsession that Stalin had about nationalism in Ukraine being a challenge to the Soviet Union. Putin denying the identity of Ukrainians, helping to push that narrative on history shows and things that are playing out for the Russian people. So I don't think we're headed for the Russian people acting like that. I don't think we know. This is their struggle. This is their cause. We are not going to be able to determine that. That's not for us to do. This is for the Russian people to figure it out. What we do owe the Russian people is to support them and to support those Russians, now many working from exile, that are producing Russian language content, that are trying to get information into their brothers and sisters across the country. And I think that's where our focus is. This is not for us to orchestrate. This is for Russians to be able to manage. I do think it will be interesting seeing coming through this. Russia's going to take a huge hit, economically, politically, but in many respects, it doesn't engender a change. An autocracy where he protects his own economy, where he doesn't care about some of the costs that happen against his own people, where he turns to rhetoric that every Russian who's struggling for food can be blamed on the United States. We're going to see more and more of this, and so it's going to get darker, a lot darker. You never know when something like that can be. On the Ukrainian side, I won't go through the whole set of issues with Ukraine, but I do think we saw a very hesitant approach in the United States and some Western allies on support for Ukraine to help build up its capacity. That's changing. That's changing. And so we need to be there in big time in terms of support for civilian populations, the humanitarian flows, recognizing as I talk to organizations across Ukraine, the big international organizations can't operate in many of the dangerous locations where Ukrainian organizations are. So we're very much focused not on an international response, but on supporting indigenous Ukrainian groups that actually have built micro networks that are still operating in Mariupol, that are still operating in Kharkiv, that are still actually active in Kherson, and how to empower them, because again, it's this activation of the Ukrainian people, their ability to be part of the response, which is, I think, going to be critical to stopping Russia. That said, there is a lot more coming, a lot more to be done on the military side. What we don't want to see is that every time we just need more bloodshed to lead to more rapid movement on these decisions. So you'll see a little bit more of this playing out at the NATO summit this week, but it's both a combination of that civilian support, the political support, and the military support. There are big debates over no-fly zones and how to avoid escalation with Russia, and that's true. And I think maybe Rose will talk about this. When I was in the White House, Russia invaded Georgia. It was really painful because we took the same difficult decisions. Were we ready to go into a war with Russia over Georgia? And pretty early on, the president took a clear decision that we were not going to try to escalate this. But one of the things we have to be careful about is telling our adversaries what we're not going to do. You need to keep some ambiguity about your actions, because when you forecast we're not going to do anything in Ukraine, it just reinforces a sense of what you can get away with. So in Georgia, which is very different, the international response in some respects is so much better now because people understand the gravity of what's happening. But in Georgia, I was there in the Oval Office when we decided to change the humanitarian mission to Georgia from USAID to the US military. It actually it didn't serve any purpose logistically. USAID had warehouses ready to go. We had commercial contract carriers ready to go. It's made for fast response. But we thought that if we could send in humanitarian supplies on C-17s, send naval ships into the ports, have TV cameras there showing that they were actually just delivering humanitarian supplies. And so we had Mike Mullen, the head of our armed forces, call his Russian counterpart, and we told the Russians that we were sending in C-17s with humanitarian supplies and parked them at Tbilisi airport. We didn't ask for permission. We told them what we were doing and when we were doing it. And we left them sitting in Tbilisi. The Russians ended up not coming to Tbilisi. Who knows what happened? Who knows how all these things played out? And there was a little bit of a risk there that we were undertaking as well. But it just shows that it's tricky where the last thing we want to do is find ourselves in a full-blown war with Russia, obviously. But having some strategic ambiguity that complicates their calculations, I think, is really important in this effort as well. Let me stop with that. I'll take a few questions at a time. So why don't we pick up one of the students over there? Maybe let's take 3 questions at a time. I'll be quicker on that. I'm going to write them down.
Hi, my name is Christina Farrell.
Yes.
And I wanted to
Who studied in Estonia.
Yes. I wanted to ask your opinion about the enforced disappearances in Ukraine as well as the Chechen Republic and your opinion on the Russian strategy of those disappearances.
Perfect. Please, sir, and then I'll come back to you there.
Thank you for being here today. So much talk about democracy and democracy building. There was one very large democracy that abstained from the UN vote condemning the invasion of Ukraine, and that was India. And they're a really important democratic country. And so, I don't know, just is the fact that they're not siding with us and with NATO, is that evidence that democracy doesn't necessarily mean you all join together to fight invasions? Does it increase our chances that they'll be able to condemn what Russia is doing? What's your take on India? Thanks.
And then why don't we pick this up? Oh, you've got a mic. I'll take these 2. We'll do 4 back to back.
Yes, Andy Purdy. Let me make a comment that may be obvious. The strategic ambiguity comment, I think everyone would agree that we shouldn't say what we're not going to do. I would suggest that even if we had not said what we're not going to do, Russia still would have gone into Ukraine. But absolutely. I think the more important point is on the old model of Radio Free Europe. You made some comments. Isn't it fundamentally important? Isn't there a challenge that perhaps technology could help with, that we could have a much better chance of getting the truth to the citizens of Russia and some of these other countries to give them a chance to make more informed decisions on their own?
And then we'll take this final one in this batch, please.
Hi, Lynn Meredith. Thank you for today. I love your perspective and your endorsement of supporting the democratic features and people in each of these communities, each of these countries. Occam's razor, the simplest solution, right? We know we're going to do both things. We're going to be strategic as well as support. We tried this in Iraq and Afghanistan with winning the hearts and minds of the people. We got big pushback from our own people in the United States. How do you see this? How do you see our national response to this kind of a strategy? Do you think it will be better, stronger this time, this go? How long will it last? What is our appetite for it here in the United States?
Sure, thank you. So Christine raised a very important issue, whether a Soviet tactic or a Russian tactic. It's targeted disappearances of individuals. In fact, before the war began, this administration did a remarkable job, just a remarkable job of, and I know how difficult this is, of declassifying information and intelligence and getting it out to the world. And before they went public with all of this, they called us at the Endowment to say, look, we want you to be aware that we have reason to believe that activists, individuals in Ukraine that are the profile of those that the National Endowment for Democracy supports will be targeted, that there could be specific lists, and that we have evidence of kill and capture teams. You know, this is real assets put up against this. So this is terrifying because it is real. We've seen 2 mayors that were abducted in the south of the country. We've seen 2 journalists that have now been disappeared, abducted as well. This is part of what's concerning, is at the time you have both just a brutalistic attack on civilians, which has been a Russian war tactic. We documented in Syria and others. We documented in Syria how Russian aircraft intentionally, we targeted one hospital in particular. There was a neighborhood of Aleppo where civilians had not withdrawn. It was one of the last redoubts that they could not conquer in Aleppo. And it was in part because the hospital remained operational. There was a lifeline in the community. We documented how the Russians attacked that hospital 6 times. It was the destruction of the hospital so that you could force the civilians out. So we know they're blunt of force to moving civilians. On top of that, what's scary is targeting those who have a very public track record in Ukraine of speaking out against Russia, or speaking out against corruption. And so we've only seen a few incidences play out so far, but I think we have to worry about and expect more. And I think that's one of the chilling aspects. I mean, it's hard when you see just civilian destruction, but to know that there are also teams that are designed to be targeted against individuals that could be complicated. Now, this is becoming more difficult for them because they thought that flex some muscles, intimidation, target a few outspoken individuals, and then you co-opt the others. You get some pretenders, you get some politicians that can come in and play this role. And so it's going to be harder for them when you have an entire population of resistance on what to do, and yet you're still going to see this. It's why oftentimes the individuals that we support don't want us to hide their identity. They actually prefer to be known because they feel like being known is a little bit more of a source of protection for them. India is a really important player here, and it's over time. I mean, India is one of the most important, biggest, largest democracies in the world, going through its own bout of populism at home, its own bout of Hindu nationalism throughout its politics. As we see in democracies, polarization, all of that. But it's also got a complicated record anchored in its identity of a non-aligned movement, and anchored in particular in a very close relationship between the Indian military and the Russian military. And so I'm not totally surprised by what we've seen from India. It is disappointing because this is such a stark situation. The investment that we've made, whether in a Quad or others, to try to increasingly welcome India to the table as a partner. So it doesn't mean I give up on that. I think democratic unity is important. But democratic unity over time is about how we overcome the legacy of the East-West Institute, of an East-West prism, and have countries from India to South Africa to Brazil as major democracies at the table as part of democratic unity. And that's going to be a generational continuing commitment. It is really disappointing to see India not just abstain from a UN vote, but to speak out about providing alternative markets for Russian oil and gas, and to speak out about potentially military cooperation, which would be, I think, really, really problematic. So it's disappointing, if not totally surprising, and it just shows how much work we have to do. Just because you are a democracy doesn't mean we're going to have aligned interests and approaches on some fundamentals about how you treat your people. It does change the dynamic, I think, and makes it much more, I believe in democratic peace, but work to be done. You're right, Vladimir Putin was going into Ukraine and had actually been telling us that and forecasting that, and we really didn't want to believe it. You asked about technology. Yes and no. So we're spending a huge amount of our time, and our partners are spending a huge amount of their time on how to use technology to ensure access to information. But so are the authoritarians. China's firewall is pretty, the Great Firewall is pretty impressive. The Russian one has been less effective. And part of it was also less effective because the Russian people became so committed to some platforms, like places like YouTube, major sources of entertainment for the Russian population. It's a source of monetization for that community. And so there were real tensions in Russia because the backlash from the population of cutting off access to some of the internet. Now we're seeing some of the walls coming down in a sharper way, trying to really promote alternative Russian platforms. And so there are still opportunities. VPNs provide access for those who are willing to download them, use them. And for a young generation, that's not that hard. It's pretty common. They're pretty familiar, can do it on their phone. But for large swaths of the population, that's not in their realm. The return to shortwave broadcasting is real. It's something that we've been doing, or that others have been doing in Tibet, North Korea, places like that. But it remains a real challenge because of the control of information to large swaths of the Russian population. There are still things that, even I find in the democracy support community, often not the strongest ties with the private sector. And yet I have found in my short time at the Endowment that some of the most productive conversations have been with tech companies who are working on encryption, are working on things that could be tremendous assets for Democrats around the world. And so I think this is an incredibly active hot space where Russian journalists themselves are now out helping to produce content, help figuring out how to get it in, where companies are looking at alternatives. But we've seen, really with China in the lead, how the autocrats are just as quickly trying to figure out how to control and limit these. It's a little bit of whack-a-mole on the technology front, but I hope that it offers some pathways. And Meredith, I think Iraq and Afghanistan in many respects set us back because that's not what we do. Iraq and Afghanistan were the arms of an American military invasion, which gave people a lot of arguments around the world to say we're there to impose our will. And so my institution does the exact opposite. We don't show up with a plan. We don't show up with Americans. We don't show up with anything related to the military. We simply say, what do you need? How can we help? It has to be your struggle. So to be sustainable in democratic terms in these countries, it has to be led by people in these countries. It's their future, it's their aspirations, it's their dignity. The future of Russia needs to be determined by Russians who are willing to make it happen. We need to support them, but they have to lead this effort. Therefore, it becomes sustainable. Therefore, it becomes anchored in the population. It's also what I think is important to keeping things sustainable for the American people. That we aren't asking for the type of sacrifice that comes with an Iraq and Afghanistan. This is rounding errors on a decimal to support independent media, to put some modest investment in technology to overcome China's Great Firewall. This is super cheap. This is why I see this as the most cost-effective means to national security. Rather than use the funds for an invasion of a country, to help provide modest support to those around the world who are going to help push their own countries in the vision where they want to see it evolve. And I think with that, Max?
Damon, thank you so much for your insight and for your comments. And please join me for a round of applause.
Thank you.